Great. Thanks very much, David. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to all of you today on important issues. I'm going to talk about reviving the American dream, new lessons from big data. And I'm going to start at a very big picture level by thinking about how we can measure the American dream systematically. So I think one defining feature of the American dream that people often talk about is the ideal that children should have higher standards of living than their parents. So for instance, when you ask children to assess their economic progress, they often compare their level of earnings to their parents to talk about whether they're doing well or not. Or to take another example from the political domain, President Obama noted in a recent speech that people's frustrations are partly rooted in the fear that their kids won't be better off than they were. So this notion of rising up beyond the living standards of your parents is really a central element, I think, of the American dream and of economic progress in the United States. So that leads to the natural question from the perspective of seeing how we're doing with respect to this ideal, of measuring what fraction of children actually earn more than their parents and understanding how that rate has changed over time. So those seem like very simple questions. You might think, you could just look up the answer on the internet, what fraction of kids are earning more than their parents. But in fact, it turns out to be much more complicated than that for reasons related, I think, centrally to the themes of this conference on data and poverty. So this recent review by researchers at Brookings summarizes the state of what we know about economic mobility in the context of kids doing better than their parents. How many people are better off than their parents? It really depends upon how you cut the data. And the core problem here for studying social mobility is a lack of large data sets in the United States that link parents to kids. So of course, in order to study what fraction of children are doing better than their parents, you need to be able to have data on both kids' earnings and parents' earnings in the same source. And that's something that we've lacked historically in America. So in a new paper that I'm going to talk about, which hasn't been released yet, and that's why David said this is off the record, this is collaborative work with David Grusky, Nathan Hendren, and others. We solved this serious data problem by combining census and CPS data back to 1940 with recent data from de-identified tax records. And that methodology that we developed allows us to estimate the fraction of children who earn more than their parents going back to the 1940 birth cohort. So let me show you what we find in a series of figures. So I'll start with this here, which shows you the percent of children who earn more than their parents by their parents' income percentile. So on the horizontal x-axis here is your parents' income percentile from 0 to 100. And what we're plotting is the fraction of kids who go on to do better than their parents, starting first here with kids born in 1940, the 1940 birth cohort. And what you can see is that in the 1940 birth cohort, rates of absolute mobility, that is the fraction of kids earning more than their parents, were incredibly high across the income distribution. So all the way up to something like the 80th or 90th percentile, more than 90% of kids earn more than their parents did at a comparable age. Now that number drops off at the top of the income distribution, as you might expect. Obviously, if your parents are millionaires, it's harder to do better than them, right? So you'd expect that number to come down. So that's what it looks like in 1940. Now let's look at how this evolves over time. So this is what the picture looks like in 1950, 1960, 1970, and 1980. You can see that rates of absolute mobility in the United States have steadily declined over time. And the fraction of children now doing better than their parents hovers at something like 50%. Importantly, note that this change occurs not just at the bottom of the distribution, but is actually more pronounced in the middle and the top of the income distribution, where you really see quite substantial declines in the fraction of children who are achieving that American dream ideal of making progress in real terms relative to their parents. Another way to look at these data is to combine all the parent income groups and just look on average at the fraction of children who are earning more than their parents by birth cohort. And you can see, as we saw earlier, that for the 1940 birth cohort, that average was above 90%, and it's just steadily fallen over time to rates of around 50% today. It's basically a coin flip in America as to whether you'll do better than your parents or not. Now, why has this change occurred? To give you some insight into what's driving this dramatic decline in rates of absolute mobility, it's useful to look at the income distributions of children relative to their parents in different eras. So this chart here shows you the income distribution of children and their parents for kids born in the 1940 birth cohort. And we're measuring incomes here when people are around 30 years old. So you can see that for kids born in 1940, their incomes lie well above the income distribution of their parents. So to give you one example, if you had parents at the 80th percentile of the parent income distribution for kids born in 1940, you had to reach only the 14th percentile of the kids distribution in order to beat your parents. So you didn't have to do very well relative to other kids in order to be earning more than your parents. One way to think about it is virtually all children born in 1940 ended up earning more than their parents. And that's why you end up with rates of absolute mobility of 90%. Everyone in America was making progress relative to their parents. Now, if you look at the analogous picture for children born in 1980, you see a very, very different set of distributions where for kids now born to parents at the 80th percentile, that's the distribution shown in blue, they have to reach the 74th percentile of the children's income distribution in order to beat their parents. And this is just a simple consequence of the fact that growth in America now accrues primarily to the very upper tail, and there's been stagnation of wages throughout much of the distribution. And as a result, only something like half of kids are doing better than their parents did in the past. So these questions, these results naturally lead to the question of, broadly, what policies can revive absolute mobility in America? How can we get back to the rates of absolute mobility that we saw in the 1940s and 1950s? There are two key macroeconomic changes that have occurred in the United States over the past half century. The first is that we now have lower GDP growth rates than we did in the 1940s and 1950s. And that force, quite intuitively, might lead to lower levels of absolute mobility relative to parents. The second important change is that we have a less equal distribution of growth. More of the growth is going to people at the very top of the distribution rather than people at the middle or in the bottom. So given those two important trends, let's consider two hypothetical scenarios for children born in the 1980s to get a sense of what types of policy changes might revive absolute mobility. The first scenario we'll consider is a higher growth scenario, where we have a growth rate since birth corresponding to what the 1940 cohort experienced, with GDP distributed as it is today. So growth rates were about 1 percentage point higher in the 40s and 50s relative to recent decades. So basically what we're going to do here is apply that higher growth rate, so generating a bigger economic pie, but we're going to chop that pie up in exactly the same proportions that it's divided as it is today. Okay, so that's the first hypothetical scenario we'll consider. The second scenario we'll consider is a more equal growth scenario. So we have the same, let's assume we have the same GDP growth as we actually have, the lower rates of GDP growth we've experienced recently. But suppose we distribute that GDP growth across income groups in the way that it was distributed for the 1940 birth cohort. So in this exercise, think of it as keeping the size of the economic pie the same as it is today, but we chop up that pie in the proportions that it was distributed in the past. Okay, so let's consider what each of these two scenarios would do to rates of absolute mobility using this chart here. So just as a reference, I'm starting by replicating the series that we see in the data for the 1940 birth cohort, where average rates of absolute mobility were 91%, and the 1980 cohort, where the average rates of absolute mobility that we see in the data are 50%. So let's first consider the higher growth scenario, which is shown here, where everybody gets benefits from this bigger economic pie, but it's split in the same way as it is today. Now, what we see here is, as you'd expect, this increases rates of absolute mobility across the distribution it moves up the average rate of absolute mobility to about 61%. Okay, so growth helps, but it doesn't by any means, make America great again in the sense of getting us back to 1940 levels of absolute mobility. It closes roughly 1/3 of the gap. Now, in contrast, if you think about the more equal growth scenario, where we keep growth rates the same as what we've actually experienced today, but just change the distribution of growth so that growth is spread more evenly. Here, we would get back to an absolute mobility rate of nearly 80%, closing something like 70% of the decline that we've seen over the past half century. So what you can see from these two hypothetical exercises is that policies that try to increase growth rates, aggregate GDP growth rates, can do something to raise rates of absolute mobility, but they can't entirely reverse the decline. It's really critical to spread growth more equally in order to revive the American dream of high rates of absolute mobility across the distribution. Okay, so now setting that point aside, so improving GDP growth itself is insufficient to revive mobility, more equal growth really seems critical. Suppose let's say you're not interested in this issue of reviving rates of absolute mobility, and suppose your goal is just to increase rates of GDP growth. I would argue that even from that perspective, improving opportunities for upward mobility might be incredibly valuable and might be something you should be concerned about. And so to illustrate that, I'm going to focus on one specific pathway to upward mobility, particularly relevant in this audience, which is innovation. So here I'm going to describe a study in which we analyzed the lives of 750,000 patent holders in the United States by linking the universe of patent records to the tax data that we used as one of the data sources for the previous study. Again, illustrating the power of how modern data can revolutionize our understanding of key policy questions. So let me start with this chart, which shows you patent rates versus parent income. So what we're doing here is, again, looking at parent household income on the x-axis. There are 100 dots on this chart, one representing each percentile of the parent income distribution. And we're plotting the fraction of kids who go on to become inventors by their mid-30s or so, as measured by having a patent. And you can see that there's an incredibly strong relationship between your probability of having a patent and your parents' income. If you happen to be born to parents in the top 1% of the income distribution, you're 10 times as likely to have a patent as if you happen to be born to parents at the median of the income distribution. Now, what drives that relationship? One possibility is that this is about differences in economic opportunity, differences in things like the quality of schools people attend or the resources they have, the networks they have, and so forth. A different possibility is that this is about differences in ability. Maybe the kids from families in the top 1% are just more talented because of genetic transmission, and that's why they're more likely to become inventors. We can discriminate between those two explanations by bringing in another source of data, which is information on test scores relatively early in childhood. These are third-grade test scores for all kids who went to New York City public schools, another data set that we've linked to these databases. And so what you see in this chart here is, again, a plot on the y-axis of the number of kids who go on to become inventors, but this time versus their third-grade math test scores. Each dot here represents 5% of the test score distribution. And what you can see is that if you're above something like the 90th percentile of your third-grade math class, you're much more likely to become an inventor. And if you're below that point, unfortunately, it's unlikely that you're going to go on to have a patent. Now, more interestingly, from the perspective of this talk, let's now split this data by parent income, looking in the series in red at kids from relatively high-income families, so parents above the 80th percentile of the distribution, and in the blue, kids from low and middle-income families, that is, families below the 80th percentile of the distribution. And what you can see here is that there's a striking pattern, which is that high-ability children are much more likely to become inventors if they're from high-income families. If you're from a low-income family and you're at the top of your third-grade math class, your probability of becoming an inventor doesn't look all that much higher than any of the other kids in the class, right? But to put it differently, what these data suggest is in order to become an inventor in America, you really seem to need two things. You need to be smart as measured by your early childhood test scores, and you need to be from a high-income family. And when you view the data from that perspective, it gives you a very different sense of why improving equality of opportunity might be valuable. It's not merely about issues of justice. Also from the perspective of improving productivity or economic growth, if we can get more of these kids from low-income families to succeed and move up in the income distribution, for instance, by pursuing innovation, that could lead to the discovery of the next important drug or technology that will benefit everyone and increase growth rates. So I think given all of these results, the natural question moving forward is to ask, what we can do to create more equal growth and increase rates of upward mobility. And so to get some sense into that, I want to end by showing you a different set of data where we take a geographical perspective and analyze how rates of upward mobility vary across areas within America. So we've been looking at the data at the national level so far, looking at these broad national trends. Last thing I'm going to show you is examining rates of absolute mobility by metro area for children born in the 1980 cohort, the most recent cohort, to low-income families, drawing on some earlier work with Nathan Hendren. And so this map here shows you the same absolute mobility statistic that I was talking about before, the fraction of kids who earn more than their parents for 740 different metro and rural areas in the US. And this is for the subset of kids whose parents earn about $35,000. So they're somewhere around the 25th or 30th percentile of the income distribution. And what we're doing is taking kids who grow up in each of these different areas and asking what fraction of them go on to earn more than their parents when they're age 30. And you can see that there's quite a bit of variation in these rates of absolute upward mobility across areas. So in some places, in the lightest colors on the map, those rates exceed 73%, so not quite as high as the levels we saw in 1940, but close to the levels we saw in the 1960s, for example, closing something like half of the big decline we saw at the national level. But in other places, if you look, for instance, at Memphis, Tennessee, or Atlanta, Georgia, or Detroit, many of the Rust Belt states, you see quite low rates of absolute mobility, even for these kids growing up in low-income families. In Memphis, only 40% of kids growing up in families earning $35,000 a year end up earning more than that amount themselves. So there's the story really has substantial geographic heterogeneity within America. You don't want to think about that broad trend as a single pattern that applies everywhere. There's lots of variation across different places within the United States. So that, I think, gives us a lens into potentially understanding how we might revive the American dream. And so I just want to say briefly how we're tackling that problem in our research group here at the Stanford Opportunity Lab in various ways, which hopefully will give some insight into how modern data and technology can be useful in tackling these important problems. So the first broad set of projects we're conducting is trying to characterize more precisely what the recipe for success looks like in areas that currently have high levels of opportunity, the areas that have brighter colors, the lighter colors on the map that I was just showing you. And so as an example of how we do that, we look at various characteristics of these areas that correlate with these different measures of opportunity. One very important one is the rate of segregation in an area. So to give you an example, this map illustrates racial segregation in Atlanta, and the way it's constructed is that each person in Atlanta is represented by a dot using census records. And the dots are colored so that whites are blue, blacks are green, Asians are red, and Hispanics are orange. And you can see immediately that Atlanta is an incredibly segregated city with the blue dots in a completely different part of the city relative to the green dots. And corresponding to that, we find that Atlanta has some of the lowest rates of upward mobility in the United States, and more generally, cities that look like Atlanta in terms of residential segregation have very low rates of upward mobility. In contrast, if we look at Sacramento, which has a comparable black and minority share to Atlanta, the same fraction of Hispanics comparable Black and Hispanic share to Atlanta, you see that there's much more integration in Sacramento, right? The colors are just much more interspersed. And corresponding to that, places that look like Sacramento tend to have much higher levels of upward mobility. So this kind of data shows us that segregation seems to have a strong association, at least, with rates of upward mobility across areas, and we're doing more work along these lines to understand exactly what characteristics drive these differences in upward mobility across places. To go deeper, one of the things we're doing going forward is studying various local place-based initiatives using historical data where specific places have changed things like housing laws, schools, et cetera, to try to see what really seems to make a difference in terms of changing rates of upward mobility. We're also conducting field studies, sending in field teams to outlier areas that look particularly good or particularly bad in terms of rates of upward mobility to get an on-the-ground sense of what might be going on in those places. Another important aspect, I think, going forward is to analyze these data looking at variation across racial and ethnic subgroups. This illustrates a key data challenge we face so far. In the tax records we use, we don't see race and ethnicity. However, it would be completely feasible by linking census data to look at breakdowns by race and ethnicity, and that is an example of a theme David is going to talk about of how linking various data sets can really allow us to make important progress on these issues. A second approach to give you an example from a different domain. I think one of the key determinants of differences in upward mobility across areas is the structure of networks. That's, I think, one of the reasons segregation might matter so much. And so we're starting a set of projects with Matt Jackson here at Stanford using Facebook data to study how networks mediate differences in upward mobility across places and basically whether you can network yourself out of poverty. Do the people you're linked to affect your prospects of success? And then as a third example, we're working on an experiment with various public housing authorities to try to help more families move to these higher opportunity areas where kids seem to do much better. And so we're taking the housing voucher program in the US, on which we spend about $20 billion a year, and seeing if we can implement interventions on both the supply and demand side of the market to get more families to use the vouchers they're already getting to rent apartments in higher opportunity areas rather than the low opportunity areas where most vouchers are currently used. So let me conclude by coming back to this chart showing you the fading American dream. I think this is a very worrisome trend in the United States, and I think people in this room who are involved in technology and thinking about these issues at a policy level can play a central role in shaping what this trend looks like when we look at this picture 10 years from now. I think technology has played a key role, actually, in driving much of this trend. If you look at work by David Autor, Larry Katz, and others, much of the hollowing out of the income distribution we think might be due to new technologies that have replaced routine workers, leading to this pattern of fewer kids doing better than their parents. But I also think technology can play a key role in the solution to reversing this trend, both by generating new sources of data that will allow us to understand exactly what is driving this trend and what types of interventions can allow kids to do better going forward, and by potentially producing new technologies that will allow kids throughout the United States to revive the American dream and achieve greater chances of success. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.